podcast.
Humain, demain.
So we are here with Ariel Zeleznikow-Johnston. You wrote a book called The Futures Love You, and I read the book. I actually had the audiobook. It was very, very interesting about the future of humanity and the future of health and what we can hope, especially if we want to live longer and see this future. So there's definitely very good arguments on why we should live longer and what's the technical possibilities in right now, but also what we can expect. But we will delve into the book. We have a few questions, but maybe before, can you briefly introduce yourself and your background?
My day job is I'm a neuroscientist at Monash University in Australia, where I do neuroscience of consciousness. So trying to understand how it is that the brain gives rise to our conscious experiences, our experiences of color, feeling of tastes, everything that provides the world around us. But my background is in behavioral neuroscience. So I did a PhD in behavioral neuroscience, trying to understand how our genes and our environment interact to shape our cognitive abilities. And before that, I've pretty much just always been interested in neuroscience and philosophy and medicine and the intersection of all these. So the big questions of like, how are we conscious? How do we think? How is it that squishy biological material can actually do all of these, enable all of these amazing cognitive abilities that we have? But also the questions of like looking at how medicine has advanced over time, I've always been fascinated by looking backwards and seeing like how neuroscience and how medicine's evolved over the past couple of centuries and looking forwards to like, well, if we extrapolate forwards into the future, what do we realistically expect to happen? Which is just to say I'm a bit of a dilettante in on all sorts of different areas.
Thank you. Ariel, when did you begin to be interested in cryonics and when did you decide to make this a more important goal?
I've always been interested in the history of medical progress and scientific progress, in understanding like how we got to the technology we have today. And I always found it fascinating when I read descriptions of like how average life expectancy used to be 30 years and people used to die at much younger ages, and how incredible it is that we have things like antibiotics and surgery and all the things we have today. And I've always been like super also fascinated in science fiction. So books and games and movies, looking at what might become possible, both in like good versions of the future and in darker versions of the future. And so in that reading, I came across the ideas in science fiction of like things like cryonics or cryostasis or preservation, normally in the context of like somebody gets put into a cryopod, they stay there for 100 years as they travel between the stars or something, and then they come out at the end of it. And I've always been like kind of fascinated by that idea, but unclear as to like whether it would actually be possible or whether it wouldn't be possible or which bits are true and which bits are like crazy hype. And as I became a neuroscientist, and I gained more of the skills to sort of assess the area, I always had like a vague interest in like trying to understand whether it would or wouldn't be possible. But in the past 10 years or so, I saw quite a few things that pushed me towards more seriously analyzing the question. So one is that our understanding of how the brain forms memories has gotten a lot better. There's a lot of new experiments in the past 5-10 years or so of like really mapping out the specific circuits involved in memory formation in a way that makes me think that like it really does seem to be like these structures within the brain that are storing things like our memories and our psychological properties. The second thing that happened is that I became aware that brain preservation techniques, or these sorts of brain preservation techniques, were getting a lot better over time. That the tools that we could use to ensure that like those memories, those other neural connections that store information in our heads, the ways in which we could essentially capture those in animal models and theoretically also in humans had improved. And so I thought now was a good time to like really analyze the proposal in depth.
Yeah, I think it's definitely an interesting time because we can see it's becoming more and more feasible. Before it was, as you said, science fiction was used to explain how human can travel fast and far in space. But now you have a very interesting argument at the beginning of your book about the story of Elizabeth. Why did you choose this example, and why do you think it's a good example to illustrate the argument about cryonics and about the future of medicine and living longer?
At the start of the book, I tell the story of Elizabeth Hughes. So in 1919, Elizabeth was living in New York and she was 11 years old when she started getting sicker and sicker and sicker until she was eventually diagnosed as having juvenile diabetes, or what today we would call type 1 diabetes. Back in 1919, we didn't know about insulin. We didn't know what causes diabetes really. And so we didn't have any treatments for diabetes really either. And so the prognosis that Elizabeth had at the time was that she would only live a few more months before she died, as was the case for everyone who had diabetes at the time. What had recently been discovered, though, was not insulin or a cure for diabetes, but a method of extending the lifespan of people who had diabetes. People had worked out that if you were to really limit the nutrition of someone who had diabetes, so to keep their sugar levels really low, then you could extend their lifespans from a few months to maybe a few years. And so Elizabeth went to a clinic where her nutrition levels were really balanced. So she was teetering just between starving to death and having so much sugar in her blood that she started getting diabetic symptoms. Now, this wasn't a great experience for her. It was a kind of limbo. But what it did enable is that she lived for 3 years instead of dying after a few months. And then in 1921, when insulin was discovered and became available as a therapy, Elizabeth was able to access it and then went on to live into her 70s, a relatively normal lifespan after this period. And I think it's a great story in terms of an analogy to preservation or cryonics for quite a few different reasons. One is it really highlights how, people used to die of all sorts of things until one day, eventually, a new treatment came around that stopped them from dying, what historically killed everyone. So it's a great example of medical progress. But the second part that I think is great is it's really like analogous to the idea of what I have in mind of stasis, of taking someone, and even if we can't cure the disease that's killing them today, maybe we can at least prolong them in a period of limbo or stasis or inactivity until such time as we do have treatments that can restore them properly to health.
So cryonics is actually always a plan B, waiting for rejuvenation and for new treatments. Do you have a cryonic contract yourself? And did you propose it to your close relatives? Yeah. Because for me, it's always kind of a mystery that many people are interested in cryonics, but not relatively. There is a very small number of people having a contract.
Okay, I think this is a good moment of clarifying what I mean when I talk about preservation, because there's quite a few different terms that people use, whether it's cryonics or cryopreservation or biostasis or cryosuspension or fixation, preservation, all these different terms. And it'll help clarify what I'm arguing for compared to what other people might necessarily have argued for in the past. So to give people a little bit of history and context, the idea of some sort of like using cold temperatures to suspend people, to keep them in a state between being dead and being alive, has been around since about the 1960s or so. And the precedent for it was that we have seen examples from the natural world of like small frogs or other small creatures that are able to be frozen and then thawed out and survive the process. So initially people had in mind, maybe we could just use straight freezing. We could just put people down at cold temperatures. And while that works well for like some animals and for small clumps of cells, like for sperms and eggs and embryo, it doesn't really work well when you try and scale it up to a larger scale, because you get issues like dehydration and ice formation. So if you freeze a person entirely, for example, you'll see a whole bunch of dehydrative damage that does a lot of damage to their body, essentially. So then over the next few decades, there was development of something called cryopreservation through vitrification. So what happened there is you would take some bit of biology, some cells or an animal, and you would add essentially antifreeze components to that. And what that would do is it would stop ice crystal formation occurring when you lowered the creature down to colder temperatures and prevent some of the damage that would otherwise be occurring. That's what's used today for things like embryo storage. And it's why we can have in IVF and assisted reproductive therapies storage of these embryos for decades now with very little to no damage occurring to them. But there's still an issue with that process in that if you try and scale it up to larger things like organs or a whole human body, you still see damage occurring. Now, the main thing that's an issue is that you get dehydration of the tissue because the antifreeze components that are used can't get inside an organ or inside a whole human body very well or very quickly, and they suck a lot of water out of organs or tissues. Basically, this is what's preventing us from cryopreserving kidneys at the moment, or hearts or lungs at the moment, and being able to bank them for transplant cases for individuals. And so there are companies that exist at the moment, like Alcor or Tomorrow Biostasis or the Cryonics Institute or a variety of others that offer this sort of vitrification cryopreservation procedure. But if you go and you look at the brains of people who've been preserved using those techniques, what you will see is like a very large amount of shrinkage of their brains. So something like a 50% reduction in the volume of their brains. And if you try and, take imaging slices from those preserved brains, we can't at the moment verify that the structure of that brain, the things that encode someone's memories, are still there and have been preserved well. Now, that's not to say they definitely don't work. It could be the case that those structures are still there, but it does give me pause because I'm like, well, I want to see that the brain is still intact and everything can be traced out and it looks good. So that's why I'm a bit skeptical of what's being provided by some of the existing companies. But again, I know some of them are working to improve that and they're developing quality control metrics. And I don't want to say that absolutely everything they're trying won't work and is just bad. But I do hope to see improvements. But as an alternative, though, there's a different kind of treatment that some groups use that's based on what's called fixation. So that's where instead of just using cold temperatures and antifreeze, you instead use preservative chemicals and you introduce that into an animal, a human's body, in a way where these chemicals get in and they lock everything in place and they prevent any further decay. And using them, if you look at body tissue or brains that have been preserved with those methods, you can see very, very high quality preservation without the shrinkage damage, and in a way where if you take samples from a brain preserved that way, you can still trace out all the neural connections and have confidence that everything is still stored there. In terms of groups that are providing that at the moment, the only two that I'm aware of is Oregon Brain Preservation in the west coast of the US, and one group that I know that is imminently hoping to be providing it is Nectome as well, which is another group that was involved with developing one of these better techniques recently. I don't have a contract with them per se because they don't really have contracts in an ongoing life insurance-y style sense that some of the other groups do. But if I got bad news tomorrow that I was dying, I would go to one of those two and try and get them to suspend me through this fixation procedure. That was a very long answer to your question, though.
Maybe if I can go further, do they already have bodies of people? It's not so far as a project because I must admit that I didn't know about this. Well, I know about the project, but I didn't know it was so far away. Yeah.
So Oregon Brain Preservation, as far as I'm aware, does offer services where you can go to them and undergo preservation procedures. They also do research work a lot because they're trying to improve the technologies. So I'm not 100% sure in terms of how you can contract with them, what services you can do. I think to a large degree, they even offer free services for preservation. They're based in Oregon in the US because they're still interested in doing research. Nectome, as far as I'm aware, is not currently offering services, but intends to be doing so imminently, as in within the next few months or so. But they'll be doing so commercially in a way where they want to provide high quality, verified services, more akin to a paid for proper medical procedure.
Yeah, it's a very interesting difference. And I guess, for the patients who are already in Alcor, for example, given the state of the technology at the time, it's unlikely they will be able to come back. But at least it was, we don't know exactly, but it's definitely, I guess it's more like a proof of feasibility and it's moving the Overton window. If some people have done it before, it's less weird. And I guess maybe it will become mainstream at some point until we have maybe advanced rejuvenation technology.
Yeah, I mean, there's a trade-off between, if all of this was free and took up no resources, then we should be pursuing it even if we think there's a vanishingly small chance that it will work. But the problem is these sorts of procedures, they come in varying degrees of cost, but they're not completely trivial costs. It's not $10 or $100 to preserve anyone. And so we've got to trade off like how much it costs to do a preservation procedure versus what we think the probability is that it will actually work. What I see is the benefit of something like fixation procedures is that they're cheaper than just cryopreservation with antifreeze. And they're also, I think, although some people will dispute this, but I think more likely to be efficacious because they give better quality brain preservation with more information there. So I do think there's a point about trade-offs to be made without saying that like I'm definitively sure that the older techniques won't work. I do agree. It's just, the worse the preservation procedure is, the less likely it is to end up having stored what's needed for survival.
And what they are doing now is fixation, preservation of the brain only or the full body? Both are possible?
Yeah, both are possible. I think Nectome wants to offer full body fixation preservation. I'm not sure what Oregon Brain Preservation standard activities are.
Yeah, I mean, I think the arguments for preservation and this kind of stasis is very strong because I think you mentioned in the book, it's almost like going to a hospital, but in the future. It's an ambulance ride to the future instead of, because if there was two hospitals, one very close to me when I am in danger and one very far away, I would choose to go to the best one, basically, across space. But we can't do this now across time. So obviously, if we could, and I think you also have this example in the book. It's this Japanese woman. I forgot the name, but she's basically considering and at the end does it. I've always wondered something though. It's the chance that, let's say, if you are preserved like this for decades, maybe even more centuries, the chance that the facility survive that long, because there's not a lot of buildings, and that can operate without any issues for decades. Even like big infrastructure like a power plant, sometimes they fail. If you are in a country which could have a civil war, that's pretty bad. I think maybe the future won't care about, old ancestors that are in their tanks. So yeah, that's one little thing that I don't know how you think about those things.
I don't think that's a little thing. I think that's a big thing. And I spend a lot of time in the book talking about that particular concern, which is like, why would our descendants care about us enough to maintain preservation facilities, maintain storage facilities, and then one day go to all the effort that would be required in actually reviving their ancestors? Like that does seem absurd to a large degree when we think about the resources that would be required to do so. So you've got to imagine. And yeah, I do think through different scenarios. Like in the scenario where we end up with some sort of apocalyptic outcome for humanity, where we have nuclear war or horrible pandemics or runaway climate change or any of those sorts of scenarios, then there's no point preserving people because no one's going to be around to revive anyone. So like it's in one case, it's like clear that there are scenarios under which this definitely won't work, even if the technology is totally sound and like in principle it should work. But I don't see this as a reason to give up. I see it as a reason to think seriously about how can we earn the love and respect of future generations to come. Now, in part, I think that maybe even if we just carry on as we normally do, there's a reasonable chance that they will love us. Because for the same reasons why when I look back upon past generations, I actually feel a lot of love towards their efforts. Because I think about the fact that the world used to exist in a state where 1 in 2 children died before the age of 15, where most people lived in extreme poverty, where rates of violence were much higher than they are today. And I'm grateful that instead, I get to live in a world with running water and cheap food and video games and nice books and general safety. That didn't happen just out of nowhere. That happened because a lot of people in the past worked to make their world better for themselves and their children and their grandchildren. And if I could somehow help them to reach back through time, then I would do so. But I think looking towards the future, it just strengthens the argument that what we have to do today is to solve the challenges of our time, to make sure things go well, even better than the current state of the world we live in, such that there will be people who will be motivated to maintain preservation facilities and to want to revive their ancestors. Because if we end up in a good version of the future, one that's like extremely wealthy compared to today, one that's safe compared to today, then they will hopefully look back and be like, well, we have all these resources to use, and these people who were preserved, who we're grateful for, yeah, it sounds like it would be a fun idea and nice for them to bring them back. That's why I called the book The Future Loves You, because I think we have to think seriously about this intergenerational credit and responsibility.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty obvious that if we were in their shoes, we would be very interested to bring them back just so we could ask them questions, especially if it's a distant future. I mean, we are actually trying now to de-extinct mammoth. So I think we are very interested in knowing the past, and I think the future will probably be similar if it's a good future. And yeah, I mean, maybe the circle of compassion will be even bigger, including the past people that are preserved in their little tank. So of course, there's just one thing that I sometimes, maybe that could be the only reason why I wouldn't jump into preservation right now, is the fear that I won't be in control of what's happening to me when I wake up. My brain could be uploaded into a simulation, and who knows what the simulation is. Maybe it's a teenager in his basement creating hell, and I'm a member of this hell now, and it's even worse than death, because maybe hell doesn't exist, like the Christian hell, but we might create it, and it's a bit sci-fi, but I think when we think about the far future, we have to be open-minded about what's possible.
Yeah, a loss of control is always scary, and a complete loss of control over one's body is even more scary. So I totally understand the fear that comes from the idea of being totally at the mercy of future generations and anyone who might come along and manipulate your brain, under my apologies, one's brain at some point in the future. I do find this scary to think about. But I guess the way I think about it is it seems quite analogous to something that we often accept today, which is undergoing anesthesia for a surgical procedure. So if you need some surgery that requires you to be put to sleep for a while, you become totally at the mercy of your surgeon and the nurses and the other staff at the hospital. But the reason why most people aren't generally scared of their surgeon just doing terrible things to them while they're under anesthesia is because they have some confidence that the medical system has ethical guidelines, has best practices, has the welfare of the patients in mind, and wants to, use its services to provide a good outcome for its patients. And that exists in part because humans generally try and help each other out, but it also exists because we have good social frameworks to inform this sort of behavior and control this sort of behavior. And I guess I make the same argument going forwards that if we want something like preservation to work, I don't think what we should do is just be too scared that somebody could take our preserved brains and do terrible things with them. We should instead just be making sure that the frameworks that surround preservation as a procedure and revival, hopefully at some point, have the welfare of patients in mind, and that people don't do terrible things to them. But again, it's just there are possibilities that exist. It's what kind of a world do we build?
Okay, so we have to make sure that the future will love us, and not to have something like a helic future. Maybe one more concrete question. So if it was up to you, do you think as a neuroscientist that it is enough to cryopreserve or to have another kind of preservation of the brain? Or is it necessary to have the full neural system? So is it necessary to have a full body? And so if you had to choose, would you conserve only your brain or your full body? Well, probably your full body, because there is no risk. Can you develop a bit about that?
The question is, what is it that's important for ensuring that someone survives over time? In a general sense, whether it's through something weird like preservation and revival, or whether it's just during normal life. What makes me the same today as I was 5 years ago or will be in 5 years from now? And naively, we might think, it's because I have the same body, the same arms and legs and physical structure, and I'm made of the same materials. But it turns out that, as we eat and we drink and we breathe, we frequently change out the physical material that we're made of. So it's probably not just because we're made of the same atoms and molecules over time. Now, when you poll people and you ask them, like, what do you actually think is most important for your survival over time? What you see is that most people say it's their memories, it's their personality, it's their goals and desires, it's having a congruent psychological profile over time. So it's essentially these psychological properties and their continuity that make someone the same over time. And in a sense, that makes sense, right? Because if somebody gets a spinal cord injury and they become quadriplegic and unable to move their arms and legs, we see that as a terrible injury. But we don't normally think that that person has, as a result, become a different person. They're just injured. On the other hand, sometimes people get some like terrible injuries to their brains and their personality changes and their psychology changes. And you do have their friends and family saying, I don't really think they're the same person that they used to be before the injury. So that's again just to highlight that it's the psychological properties that our brains give us that are the core things to our identities. So to finally come back to answering your question, I do think the brain is overwhelmingly what is important for survival insofar as it provides someone with their psychological properties. But I do think the body is important as well insofar as like we always interface with the world through the medium of our body. And, you know, we need its sensory inputs and its motor outputs to do anything. And it is a loss to have those things removed or damaged, but it's not as critical as the brain and its properties. So I guess what I would say at the end then is ideally I'd do an entire body, preserve all of it. If it truly turned out that it was economically prohibitive to do an entire body as opposed to just someone's head, then I guess we could consider just doing people's heads. But ideally you'd make it cheap enough to do someone's full body that would be accessible to people too.
The intuition of most people when we ask, you know, if you do a brain transplant in another body, it's not really the body it's not a body transplant, it's really a brain transplant. So you imagine when the person wakes up in the different body, it's the person that were before in the other one, the first body. So we really think we are our brain, basically. This is, I mean, mostly probably true, I guess. But yeah, there's also like a lot of stuff linked to our personalities in our microbiome. I think, you know, like we are what we eat. Sometimes we say, I mean, it's probably a little bit of an exaggeration. Sorry, but it's yeah. And also, like you said, when people have an injury in their brain, they change personality. Even disease like Alzheimer really change people. And when they don't remember their past, even themselves, at some point they are not them. Like they're gone. Really. Like there's really just a body with different experiences, but which still morally relevant person, but we can really feel the difference there.
Yeah, just on that, I think something that's a bit confusing, but is worth noting for people, is there's a difference between some individual being conscious at a particular moment in time, being able to experience pain or to take joy or otherwise like sense the world around them, and someone being the same person across different moments in time of having experiences. So I'm conscious right now and I'm experiencing talking to you guys, but later tonight I'll go to sleep and I'll probably be unconscious for a while. And if I underwent anesthesia, I'd definitely be unconscious for a long period of time. But what makes me the same person, even though I have breaks in consciousness for a period, is that I have the same memories, I have the same personality, all those sorts of psychological properties, even through breaks in consciousness. What I would say might be happening in cases of really advanced dementia or other like severe brain injuries is you may have circumstances where there are still conscious individuals, but there's been such a loss of memory and personality and desires and other stuff that even though there's still a conscious individual there, they're not really the same person they were before. And I go through in quite a bit of detail in the middle sections of the book.
Let's go to more concrete questions. Yeah. How much does it cost the fixation that you are thinking about? How much does it cost for cryo-preservation? And is it possible that it will be cheaper in a not so far future? And yeah, also maybe once again, why do you think so few people choose for this at the moment? Do you think it's because they feel like it's not going to work or something else?
Okay, so two questions. How much does it cost? And then why aren't more people taking it up already?
Maybe the second question is because very often people say, oh, it is for rich people only because it's so expensive. But actually, when you die in my country, Belgium, you have in average more money that what's needed for the cryopreservation. So you could choose that even if you are not especially rich. And the number of people choosing that at the moment is so low. That's why my question.
Yeah, maybe I'll answer your question backwards because I think that might help. And that's the approach I take in the last chapter of the book as well, when I run through the economics of how this works. So when we think about any medical procedure, what we're concerned by is like, how much does it cost versus how much does it provide to us? And sometimes when we think things are really valuable, we're willing to spend quite a lot of money on them. So in countries like my own, Australia, we have a healthcare system, a government system, that will provide very expensive treatments to people if we think that they're worthwhile. So, for example, a heart transplant costs something like 200,000 euros or 250,000 Australian dollars or so. But the government will provide that to people for free because people who need heart transplants would likely die in the absence of having them. But if they get them, they might live another 10, 15 years or so. So it's always these trade-offs in terms of how much life are you buying for how much money. When it comes to preservation procedures, currently there aren't any healthcare systems that are providing them at the sort of scales required to drive down the costs to whatever the like minimal marginal cost would be for them. So at the moment, they are more expensive than they would be if more and more people were taking them up. But what I do in the book is I look at, well, how much do I think it would cost if it was provided at some sort of large scale? Like fundamentally, how expensive are these procedures? If you look at something like fixation, it shouldn't in principle be that expensive. It's something like my estimate for like all the chemicals and the time for the technicians would be something like $10,000 per procedure. Now, nobody's offering it at scale anywhere in the world at the moment. Oregon Brain Preservation, as I mentioned, is providing fixation procedures on people. And I think you should double check this, but I think they're indeed at the moment doing procedures for free, but you have to be in Oregon in the United States to make access to them. And I'm going to fly you out there. Nectome, who I also mentioned, who's interested in providing these fixation procedures, I have a rough memory that they're thinking of something about $60,000 US is what they would charge per procedure. It might be give or take a little bit of money compared to that. But again, you'd have to be in the west coast of the US to access that, at least initially. But those are, at the moment, issues of small scales. And I imagine that the prices should come down because fundamentally, doing this fixation procedure is not super complicated. It's way less complicated than other procedures like heart transplants or some complex surgeries that I mentioned before, let alone some of the like cancer therapies that can exist. In terms of cryopreservation procedures, I'm not really sure how much different organizations are charging at the moment. I know they tend to have complicated models based around life insurance and getting people to pay small amounts of money over a cumulative period of time to sort of fund them in the future. But I also know that they're changing the models that are being provided. Like I know Alcohol has a different system to what Tomorrow Biostasis uses in Europe. So yeah, unfortunately, I'm not fully on top of how much they're charging people at different points.
Yeah, it's very interesting in your book when you break down the cost, because I think you're going to details and it shows that it's definitely feasible in the future that it could be scaled up. And if society really believes that it's something worth doing, we could really see it happening.
Oh, sorry, I just realized that I didn't answer the second part of Didier's question, which is why aren't more people taking it up? And I think that's for a couple of reasons. One is, I think if we preserve someone, and then, today, tomorrow, next year, we were able to revive them, immediately a lot of people would be like, oh, holy shit, this actually works. Like, I would love this. If I were dying, I would definitely want to make use of this. But the problem at the moment is we can't revive anyone. So we haven't demonstrated that the technology actually definitely works. So people are pretty skeptical. And we're making theoretical arguments that, look, we think we can preserve people well enough. We think neuroscience strongly implies that this preservation procedure should work, or at least it has a high enough probability that it will work and a low enough cost to do that it's worth taking seriously. But obviously, like, if people haven't seen something works, they remain skeptical and they think of it as far-fetched. So that's one issue. But the second part to it is that like the proposal of preservation is very different from medicine as normally practiced. Normally someone gets sick, they develop some disease, they go to the doctor treats them in a like clear and legible way, and then they get better again. And they don't feel completely out of control. They don't feel like the medical system takes over them. They don't feel like they'll have to wait a long period of time. Like they don't have to wait years or decades to emerge into a world and a culture that's potentially very different from their own. And they don't feel like it's a weird dystopian sci-fi possibilities that are encompassed by getting that particular kind of treatment. Whereas when you try and initially sell preservation to people, it's like, well, what we're going to do is if you're dying, we'll take you, we'll preserve you, we'll do weird things to your body and your brain, and then we'll do even weirder things to your body and your brain in maybe 50 years from now, and you'll emerge into a weird sci-fi future. And like that intuitively is not, I think, strongly appealing to people, particularly people who aren't imminently facing death. Now, I think it might be different if you went to people who were actually dying and you were like, here is an affordable treatment that has some chance of working. Would you like to take it up? Because if you go and you actually survey those who are terminally ill, you see that the vast majority of them still have a very strong will to live and a strong desire to access treatments if only they were available. So I think there is a possibility of growing preservation and the community around it. If what we can do is we can ensure people that like it's not as like weird and dystopian as it sounds. It can be done with strong ethical guidelines. It can be done in a way in which, we're also trying to ensure that the future goes well and that future people will live good lives. And particularly if we can say to them, it won't just be you who'll undergo preservation. We'll also provide it for your friends and your family and your community, and you won't be disconnected from them at some point in the future. But that's my speculation on what's going on.
If I may say, okay, I understand all what you are saying and all the arguments, but I think that at some time, for almost all people, they decide to accept death, and so they don't want to try something else for some reasons, and maybe because we are so afraid of death that we have to accept it. It's a bit strange, but still, because for millions of people, investing 200,000 euro would not be a problem, and you are dead anyway, and still they don't choose it. So there is something really, I think, in psychology, making that people feel like they have to decide to die without any way to escape.
I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. I think if you had people with money who developed some sort of serious cancer, but who knew that if they spent $200,000 on a new cancer drug, that they had a serious chance that their cancer would be cured, that the majority of those people would take up that treatment, assuming that they thought it had a good chance of giving them a substantial longer life afterwards. But I think in that circumstance, it's very straightforward for them how the treatment would work, and it doesn't involve any disconnection from their community if they make use of that treatment. I think the problem with preservation is you're proposing something that is maybe expensive, that is not very understandable for most people, that doesn't have the backing of the medical establishment that makes people feel comfort in it, and that when they explain it to other people, people will think they're weird and strange and just trying to take money away from, those who would inherit the money from them. So I think it's got all these different elements working against it. But I think then the key thing that one has to do is like make the case for it and also make it as cheap as possible. But I don't think it's the case that people just come to accept death. Insofar as like, certainly if you ask people who are terminally ill, as I said, if you go to hospices and you survey those who are dying, a very large proportion of people still say they would like to live if they could. And indeed, from my own personal experience of people I've known who were dying, most of them were very unhappy about what was happening to them, and I think would have taken up a treatment if it had been available to them. So I just don't buy that most people come to accept death. Some do, and if they don't want to take it up, then sure, that should be their option. But I think most people just don't have a choice.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a little bit of a religious background as well for billions of people today, and like how many probably the majority of humans on Earth right now, somehow they think something is waiting for them at the end of their life. And so but it doesn't mean they won't die at all. I mean, when we're talking about extending lifespan and preservation, this kind of thing, you will still die at some point, probably, like which the universe and entropy will probably win at some point. But I think, yeah, definitely, for me, I think the biggest proof we could show to people that it works is maybe if we have a dog that, it's dying with cancer or something, or even, just dying. And 10 years later, the same dog comes back because we managed to preserve and bring it back. People will be like, wow, that's probably going to work. The same way when we didn't know how cloning would work, and then there was Dolly the sheep, and suddenly we have to ban human cloning because it's definitely possible now. I mean, a question that I could ask now is the same way human cloning was banned, maybe it's not impossible that there will be some sort of pushback against this kind of procedure. Maybe, I don't know if
it's hard to say. I mean, there's two things that I think provide some historical precedent for what you've been talking about. In terms of, can we get something like a dog or another animal and show that we can preserve it and then revive it at some point in the future? There are some small steps being made towards things like that. What I would point to, for example, is at the end of last year, there was the publication of the first full brain mapping of a fly that had been preserved. So all 160,000 neurons in the fly, all of the millions of connections between those neurons were mapped out for one particular fly. But then going beyond that, the researchers that were involved in this project also produced a sort of bad, but still somewhat functional digital version of that fly's brain, to the extent that they could sort of recreate some of the behaviors of the fly. So they're able to show that if you stimulated its artificial, like sugar sensing neurons, that it would try and stick out its proboscis, essentially try and stick out its tongue. Now, that's not the same as like properly uploading the fly or reviving it in some proper form, but it is one of the milestones on the way to being able to do that sort of behavior. And I think what we'll see over the coming years and decades, if something like preservation is ever going to work, is that you'll see more and more steps taken towards that, where we'll produce a proper upload of a fly, or we'll be able to do it for a mouse, maybe even then a dog, and then a human. And I do think that as these steps developed, that people's estimation of the likelihood of preservation working will increase over time. So that's the first point. In terms of historical precedents, like, will people ban this? Will people accept it? Will they take it up? What will happen? I think one of the interesting ones in comparison to human cloning is actually the development of IVF, of artificially assisted reproduction. What I find interesting about it is prior to the first IVF procedures being done, there was actually no ethical guidelines that existed for it. People just sort of worked on it, and then eventually they worked on it in animal models, and then eventually some doctors decided to try and do it in human patients who wanted to make use of it. Immediately after that initially happened, there was a whole bunch of criticism of like, oh, should we be doing this? Should we have test tube babies? Where you had some people who were like, this is great. Let's people have kids who otherwise wouldn't be able to have kids. And some people were like, this is terrible. It's like bad for women. It's bad for humanity. It's bad for cultural reasons, religious reasons, whatever. What emerged afterwards was sort of the development of guidelines and regulation, I think from memory to a large degree, that originated from the sort of medical community itself before becoming legislated to a degree as well. And I just look at that scenario and I think that what we want to do is ensure that people who are interested in promoting preservation and revival make sure that we're always doing so in a way that like seems and is very ethical and very well regulated to the broader community, so that when we reach milestones like being able to revive a dog or something else, we'll be able to say, look, we've been developing consent forms, we've been developing guidelines, we're trying to make sure that this is cheap and accessible to people, and that we won't take people's brains and upload them into hellish scenarios. And I think it's those sorts of things that hopefully will ensure legislators don't ban it, but instead are like, okay, no, that sounds like maybe something we should be pursuing and adding to healthcare systems.
Speaking about medical progress, first, like you said, and this is interesting, I never thought about this, Most people, when they are at the end of their life, if they are proposed for new therapy, they will accept. But most people at the end of their life, if they have the possibility to choose cryonics, they don't choose it. So many longevists think that work from people as you is useful because it encourages research for life extension. But there are a few others who will say that it makes the sense of urgency lower. And also that it makes the interest for research for longevity only for rich people. So how do you, well, you answer already for a part, but how do you answer this specific remark of a small group of people that delays research for life extension itself?
I think that this is not really the main problem behind the lack of funding and resources put into traditional sort of anti-aging life extension research, where I look at the numbers at one point early on in the book, but I think it's something like a single digit percentage of research funding for medical research is spent on understanding aging biology and trying to treat aging, compared to developing treatments for cancer or kidney disease or heart disease or dementia, other specific therapies. Now, this isn't even like the medical community is barely considering the possibility of preservation. So they're certainly not deciding to not fund anti-aging research and longevity research because they're like, oh, no, it's fine. We'll just preserve people and we'll work it out and revive them at some point in the future. The issue is that just people aren't taking seriously that the main thing that drives the increased risk of cancer, increased risk of dementia, increased risk of all of these diseases is aging. And I think what the anti-aging community is trying to do is trying to make it very clear to people that, like, actually the main thing, like the main risk factor for essentially all diseases is aging. And that's what we should focus on. Now, to bring it back to preservation and how preservation is involved in this, I certainly, like myself personally, do not find that the fact that I might make use of preservation makes me less concerned about putting resources into anti-aging research. Primarily because, one, I'd love to not have to use preservation. I'd really like it if, I could just continue on in my current body, feeling the way I am, enjoying the world, not having to go through a period of stasis. And also because I'm not sure preservation will work. Like, I think there's a reasonable chance it will work, and given how much it costs to do, that it's worth doing. But there's no guarantee. There's no guarantee with anything. And like the amount of benefit that would be provided by developing good anti-aging drugs or therapies or anything is immeasurable, whether or not preservation works. At least that's my own view. I can't speak for others.
Yeah, definitely. I think there is in your book, you spend quite some time talking about mind uploading as well, or at least uploading in general, scanning the brain. So it makes sense if we assume that you can get a brain preserved and come back in the future. Maybe the best way is to upload it to a computer. Yeah, I guess a computer. But so I guess two questions. The first is, what reasons or evidence make you believe mind uploading will be feasible in the future? Because it's been a staple of science fiction for quite some time, but it's still, I guess, sci-fi a little bit, or it's becoming a little bit more, I guess, plausible, feasible, because we, as you mentioned, we managed to do a scan of the brain of a fruit fly and a nematode worm, but human beings have billions and billions of neurons. But even if it works, what makes you think mind uploading is generally surviving death and not just creating a copy of oneself?
So yeah, I mean, the first thing I would just say is, like, everything's science fiction until one day it's not. There were people in the early 19th century writing about the possibility of, flights or rockets back when it was science fiction. And then a few decades later, it became real. So just because we can't do something now doesn't mean we won't be able to do it in the future. And as you said, yeah, the fly example is one example of the first steps towards actually being able to achieve it in mice and maybe humans. But the question is, even if we can get it to work, we could upload a person, by which I mean we could take all of the behavior that a person exhibits. We could look at all the ways in which some individual's brain functions, look at all those connections, look at all that activity, and translate it into a new digital electronic format. Would that still be the same person, or would it just be a copy of the person. And what I would say is, well, we got to think back again about what makes someone the same person over time. And what makes me the same person today as I was 5 years ago, even though I'm made of completely different atoms and molecules. And that holds true for inside my brain as well. So like the synapses, the connections between neurons, the molecules that make those up, I think are replaced on roughly the order of a few months or so. So almost none of the material in my brain is the same material as that was there a few years ago. But I still think I'm the same person and that I've survived in the same way. Now, some people think that's through the continuity, unbroken, continuous stream of consciousness. And that if you uploaded someone, you'd have a break in their consciousness, and then it's definitely not them, the same person anymore. To that, I would say again, well, we have breaks in consciousness when we go to sleep. We have breaks in consciousness when we undergo anesthesia. And in particular, there's a surgical procedure that's already used commonly today, where what we will do is we will induce hypothermia in people. So if you take someone and you lower them down to 18 degrees Celsius, their heart will stop, all their brain activity will stop. They look like they're a corpse, but surgeons have a 45 to 60 minute operating window or so where they can perform some procedures and then warm a person back up again, and their heart activity will restart and their brain activity will restart, and they'll still say they're the same person. So what that says is we don't need to be made of the same material to still be the same person over time. And we don't need to have an unbroken stream of consciousness to still be the same person over time. So what I would say in the case of uploading is that if you manage to transfer the memories, personality, goals and desires, all the psychological properties that make someone who they are, you have really captured them in the same way that an individual survives naturally over time. I can pause there. I can go through some of the counter arguments. People might push against me as well, if you're interested.
There is something that I was thinking is, let's say I wake up in the future in a body, like so some future hospital in the year 22-5 managed to do some brain transplant, and I'm in a new healthy body. Great. But they tell me they also scan my brain and there is an uploaded version of me somewhere. So the question is like, well, am I the two person? And so the problem of identity is very interesting in those questions, in those scenarios, because in your book you also talk about the teleportation machine from I think Bertrand Russell, where if you go in the machine and scan your atoms, beam them to Mars, there is an assembly of your atom there, and you come back and you say, okay, I've traveled to Mars. I'm the same person. But if the machine also created a copy because some malfunction there, I think your argument is that it's also the same person?
Yeah, briefly, by the way, it's Derek Parfit, who's the philosopher who popularized the idea. But yeah, very briefly, my argument is that they would be the same person. Now, that might seem a little bit weird, but again, I remind you that like at one time point over time, I'm sitting here on this chair. Later on, I'm going to go eat dinner. Later on, I'll be somewhere else. So in a sense, if we look at people across time, we're quite happy to accept that like my conscious experience and myself can be at different locations in space. But what happens with these teleportation style scenarios or uploading style scenarios is we have the weird circumstance where the same person is arguably in two different places at the same time. And that seems like it can't be right. And in particular, I think the main thing that people don't like about it is it means that there can be two different sets of experiences that become disconnected for each other. So if we imagine like individual A and individual B having their experiences, these experiences are no longer connected to each other. So that seems like, well, that must be two different people. The initial pushback I would give against that, though, is if we remove some of my experiences. So let's say I get a head injury and I lose 5 minutes or 10 minutes of memories. While we see that as harm being done to me, we don't see that as me becoming a completely different individual. And I would say with like the person A and the individual A and the individual B, that as long as they have pretty much the same personality, goals, memories, psychological properties, that is what we use to define them as the same person. And it's only after a long amount of experience had occurred to those individuals separately that we would start to think about them as maybe being different people from each other. That's not to say that I think, just because an individual exists in multiple bodies, that means that we can't do harm by destroying one of those bodies or something. But I think the harm is is not quite murder. It's more you're destroying that set of experiences, which amounts to that set of memories as part of that individual. But it gets a bit complicated and technical. And if people are interested in this, I'd recommend they have a look at the chapter. The one last thing I would say, though, is if you ask people, like you poll them on these teleportation scenarios or the uploading scenarios, the majority of people do actually say that, yeah, you can be in two different places at once. It's about like 70% or so of people end up thinking that you'd survive these uploading or teleporting scenarios. So there's disagreement, but it's the more common view.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think I understand the idea is basically as soon as the procedure happen and you start to go into different direction, the copy and you and the copy think the same, you're the same person, but then time start to change and bring differences in perception, memories, but you have the same past. So it's almost like a twin that's exactly like you. And because arguably a twin is the same person. T0 basically. Okay, so I think we've reached like the hour. So I don't know if maybe there's just one more question I wanted to ask you because you're a neuroscientist. I'm curious to know what's your favorite theory of consciousness, if you have one. I leave you with the biggest question at the end, and anything you wish we asked you, maybe if you have more to say about your book or whatever.
I'll briefly talk about the consciousness one, although talking about theories of consciousness could easily take many, many, many hours. I think what people might enjoy knowing about is in the neuroscience of consciousness community, in the past couple of months or so, there was a publication in Nature Neuroscience, which is the main neuroscience journal, saying that one group of neuroscientists called the theories of another big group of neuroscientists pseudoscience. And then the other group argued back saying that like, no, it's like super justified. You guys are totally inappropriate to be bad-mouthing our theories. And this keeps happening back and forth at the moment. And the reason why this is happening is there's a whole bunch of different theories of consciousness with different assumptions and different views and different ideas. And there's really very little agreement within the community. Now, I work in this space, and I'm kind of not a partisan of any particular theory. I'm aware of the advantages and the disadvantages of all the different ideas, where some people think that to be like the thing that matters for consciousness is just like being able to perform particular functional abilities. Whereas other people think the thing that matters for consciousness is having information in your brain structured in any one particular way. Others think it's about being biological in some particular way. Some even less common theories think it's about quantum mechanics that happens in your neurons in some way. And the main thing I would say is like, I just think we need to do more science and more philosophy in this space, and that it's an interesting question, but I don't think it's going to be solved anytime soon. And if you come across someone who says like they have solved consciousness, ask them what proportion of the community actually thinks they're right yet.
Okay, yeah, well, that's a good way to end. Thank you. I think, very, very good conversation. I love the book. Do you think, I don't know if the book is going to be released in French? Or do you have any?
I'm not aware of it being released in French anytime soon, but it's only recently been out in like hardback, audiobook, ebook. So yeah, I think it takes a little while before it would be released in French. But I suppose these days you could get the ebook and then just run it through Google Translate or get ChatGPT to translate it into French for you.
Yeah. Those LLM, they can read books now. Yeah, the context window is very long. Okay, well, anyway, I mean, people can understand English. We live in the 21st century. So yeah, especially in France.
It was a very interesting conversation. Maybe next time we could also speak about AI, consciousness of AI and so on. But is there something that you want to add that you had no time to say? That?
No, I think we covered most of the things I'm interested in with respect to this space. So yeah, that was good. Good questions.
Great. Okay. Well, we will put all the links in the description, and we encourage people to get the book, read it, or listen to it. And thank you for your work. And hopefully you'll have another book at some point, maybe with some updates on the technology. Hopefully will be positive updates. It's definitely something I wish we could have as an option instead of just going to the cemetery.
Thanks for having me on.